I was halfway through cleaning a massive haul of striped bass on my back deck, scales flying and a cold beer sweating on the railing, when I heard that unmistakable sound of gravel crunching in my driveway. And I just knew. The piece was over. I looked up, wiping my hands on a grease-stained rag, just in time to see a massive, rusted tow truck backing toward my private dock like it owned the zip code, its engine growling with this aggressive, low-end rumble that made my stomach turn. I remember muttering, end quote, "You gotta be kidding me," end quote, as I jogged up the path from the boathouse, still wearing my salt-crusted boots, and there she was, Cynthia Thorne, the HOA president, standing there with a clipboard clutched in her perfectly manicured, predatory-looking claws, looking every bit like a parking lot warden with a personal vendetta and a soul made of pure, unadulterated HOA bylaws. End quote. Cynthia, end quote. I called out, trying to keep the fire out of my voice, but failing miserably, end quote. "What in the name of God is this?" End quote. She turned toward me, all pearls and pastel-colored rage, and looked at me like I was something she'd found stuck to the bottom of her shoe, saying, end quote, "Gideon Vance, your vessel is in flagrant violation of Community Clause 14.3, which clearly states that no oversized craft may be stored on personal property within view of the public corridor," end quote. I just blinked at her, honestly stunned by the sheer audacity of it, and I said, end quote, "You mean the 30-foot Grady White that I keep docked behind my own house on my own private waterfront, which I pay a premium in property taxes for," end quote. She didn't oppose, to even flinch, just snapped back that it was an eyesore that, end quote, residents, end quote, were complaining, though we both knew the only resident with a problem was the woman currently trying to steal my boat. And she gestured to the tow truck driver, who was already hopping out of his cab with chains rattling, looking like he really didn't oppose to want to be there, but was too afraid of Cynthia to say no. I stepped right into her personal space, smelling the expensive perfume and the cheap desperation for control, and I told her, end quote, "Cynthia, you're trespassing, and so is that truck. This ISN and oppose. TA cul-de-sac with plastic lawn gnomes and height-restricted grass. This is a working waterfront zone, and that dock is legally mine," end quote. But she just flipped through her papers like she was auditioning for a courtroom drama, talking about, end quote, neighborhood aesthetics, end quote, and, end quote, visual pollution, end quote, until I finally reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, dialing a number I'd kept on speed dial since the day I bought this place. She scoffed, telling me I could call whoever I wanted because the HOA had, end quote, absolute jurisdiction, end quote, over the neighborhood standards, but her smug little face started to flicker and fade when she heard me say, end quote, "Yeah, hi, Coastal Harbor Police? I got a grand theft in progress on private waterfront property. No, I'm not joking. I've got a tow truck operator trying to winch a legally moored vessel off a deeded dock," end quote. 10 minutes later, the blue and white lights of a harbor patrol unit came bouncing down my gravel drive, and out stepped Officer Miller, a guy who spent 20 years on the water and has zero patience for landlocked bureaucracy. And he didn't oppose to even look at Cynthia first. He just walked straight to the dock, looked at my boat, and then turned to me, asking if I had the deed. I handed him the paperwork I keep in the boathouse, showing every inch of my property from the street line all the way to the bulkhead, including the submerged land rights I'd fought for 6 years ago. And Miller just nodded, turned to Cynthia, and said, end quote, "Mind oppose. You need to understand something very quickly. This is a navigable waterway governed by state marine law, and your little neighborhood club has exactly zero authority once a hull touches this water," end quote. Cynthia started, sputtering, her face turning a shade of purple that matched her blouse, trying to argue that the HOA bylaws superseded everything. But Miller just cut her off, looked at the tow truck driver and told him, end quote, "If you don an oppose, unhook that winch and get this rig off this property in the next 60 seconds. I'm booking you for attempted grand larceny and trespassing. And trust me, your boss won an oppose. Pay the bail for an HOA dispute," end quote. The driver didn't oppose. Need a second invitation. He backed out of there so fast, he nearly flattened my mailbox, leaving Cynthia standing there in the dust, her jaw working like she was chewing on broken glass. And As she stomped toward her car, she hissed at me that this wasn't an oppos. Tea over, that I was going to regret making a scene in front of the board. I just grinned, feeling that first real rush of adrenaline, and told her, in quote, "You're right, Cynthia, it's just getting started," in quote. And I meant it, though I had no idea just how dark and twisted her little, in quote, enforcement, in quote, campaign was about to get. The very next morning, I stepped out to get the mail and found a bright yellow violation notice zip-tied. Not taped, but industrial-strength zip-tied to my mailbox, and it wasn't an oppos. Just a warning. It was labeled, in quote, final notice of immediate seizure, in quote, claiming that a, quote, special session of the Waterfront Compliance Committee, in quote, had granted the board emergency powers to remove, in quote, non-conforming marine debris, in quote. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring at that notice and thinking about how I'd attended every single HOA meeting for 3 years, and I had never, not once, heard of, in quote, Waterfront Compliance Committee, in quote. So I fired on my laptop and started digging through the community portal. I spent 4 hours scrolling through buried PDF files and archived meeting minutes until I found it. A single-line item added to a document posted at 4:15 in the morning on a Tuesday, claiming a special session had been held to address, in quote, urgent aesthetic threats, in quote. But there were no names listed, no vote counts, no location for the meeting, just a vague timestamp and Cynthia's digital signature. It was a ghost committee, a complete fabrication designed to give her a legal-sounding shield to hide behind while she harassed me. And I felt this cold, hard knot of anger settle in my chest because this wasn't an oppos. Just a nosy neighbor anymore. This was procedural fraud. And if she was doing it to me, she was doing it to everyone. Just as I was about to call my lawyer, I heard footsteps on the gravel again, and I looked out the window to see a guy I didn't oppos, recognize, dressed in a tactical vest with a high-end DSLR camera and a massive zoom lens, leaning over my privacy hedge to take photos of my boat, my back deck, and even peering into the windows of the boathouse. I stepped out onto the porch, my boots thudding heavy on the wood, and shouted, in quote, "Hey, you looking for a job or just looking for trouble?" End quote. And the guy didn't oppos. To even flinch, just kept clicking away until I walked down the steps and got right in his face. He told me his name was Marcus Thorne, Cynthia's nephew, as it turned out, and that he was a, quote, compliance officer, in quote, documenting, in quote, non-compliant structures, in quote. And when I told him he was on private property, he just smirked and said anything visible from a, quote, publicly accessible vantage point, in quote, was fair game for documentation. I watched him walk away, talking into a wireless earpiece like he was some kind of Secret Service agent. And it clicked. This wasn't an oppos. About the boat. It was about a coordinated effort to build a, quote, case, in quote, against me that would hold up in an HOA hearing where Cynthia held all the cards. I called my cousin Elias, who works in the county zoning office and has a brain like a legal encyclopedia, and I asked him what happens when an HOA starts inventing committees to bypass state law. And I could hear him laughing through the phone as he said, in quote, "Gideon, they're not just breaking the rules. They're flirting with a massive civil rights violation and potentially criminal harassment. If they're manufacturing authority without a board vote, the whole association is liable for every penny of damage they cause," end quote. The next few days were a blur of escalating psychological warfare. I received a formal letter from a law firm 3 towns over, threatening me with daily fines of $500 until the boat was removed, and every time I went outside, I saw Marcus or another one of Cynthia's, in quote, volunteers, in quote, lurking near the edge of my property with cameras and clipboards. But I wasn't oppos, just sitting there taking it. I was documenting the documenters. I had my own cameras rolling 24/7, and I was collecting every time-stamped email and every metadata-rich PDF that Cynthia was foolish enough to upload to the public portal. I even called the law firm at the bottom of the threat letter and got through to a junior associate who sounded like he was about 12 years old. And I asked him to cite the specific section of the state code that allowed a private association to seize a vessel from a navigable waterway. The silence on the other end of the line was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. And when I told him I had proof that the, in quote, committee, in quote, authorizing his letter didn't oppos, legally exist, he hung up so fast I thought the line had died. Everything came to a head at the monthly HOA meeting that Thursday. The community center was packed, mostly older folks who just wanted to talk about the pool hours and the mulch budget. But they all went quiet when I stood up during the open comment period with a thick black binder tucked under my arm. Cynthia was sitting at the front of the room, looking like a queen on a throne made of beige plastic, and she tried to shut me down before I even opened my mouth, saying that in quote, individual property disputes in quote, wherein an oppose, a matter for the General Assembly. I just smiled, looked out at the crowd, and said, in quote, this ISN and oppose, TA dispute, Cynthia, this is a presentation on how the president of this board is using your dues to hire her nephew to stalk neighbors and fabricate legal documents in the middle of the night, end quote. You could have heard a pin drop. I spent the next 20 minutes laying it all out. The fake committee, the 4 a.m. timestamps, the Harbor Patrol report, and the fact that the law firm they were paying with community funds had no idea they were being used to enforce imaginary rules. I saw the other board members, people like Mrs. Gable and David, the retired architect, looking at Cynthia with this growing sense of horror as they realized she'd been acting entirely on her own, signing their names to, in quote, unanimous, in quote, decisions they'd never even heard of. Cynthia's composure didn't and oppose. Just crack, it shattered. She started screaming about, in quote, protecting property values, in quote, and in quote, maintaining the soul of the community, in quote. But the more she yelled, the more she looked like a cornered animal, and by the time the meeting was over, a motion had been made to suspend her enforcement powers indefinitely pending a full internal audit. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I'd won the war, thinking that now I could finally get back to my fishing and my quiet life on the water. But as it turns out, people like Cynthia Thorndon and oppose, go away quietly, they go underground. The following Tuesday, I woke up to a silence that felt heavy, and when I walked out to the street to get the paper, my heart stopped for a second. My mailbox wasn't an oppose. Just damaged, it was gone. The heavy wooden post had been yanked clean out of the ground with enough force to leave a crater in the dirt. I followed a trail of muddy boot prints that led from the street around the side of my house and straight to the boathouse, and when I looked up at my motion-sensing security camera, my blood ran cold. The wires hadn't and oppose. Been cut, they'd been unscrewed, the bolt removed with professional precision, and the lens tilted toward the ground. This wasn't and oppose, a petty act of vandalism by a disgruntled neighbor. This was a tactical entry, and whoever did it knew exactly where my blind spots were. Or at least, they thought they did. I went back inside, my hands shaking just a little, and pulled the backup drive from the secondary camera I'd hidden in the rafters of the boathouse. A tiny bird-sized lens that I'd installed months ago, just for my own peace of mind, and I queued up the footage from 3:30 a.m. There, in high-definition infrared, were two figures in dark hoodies. One was Marcus, the nephew, carrying a set of bowl cutters, and the other was a wiry, older guy I'd seen whispering to Cynthia at the back of several meetings, a guy the board called their, in quote, property standard advisor, end quote. They weren't an oppose. Just looking for violations. They were looking for a way in, testing the locks on the boathouse, and checking the hull of my ship for any sign of a leak they could, in quote, report, in quote, as an environmental hazard. I didn't in oppose. Call the HOA this time. I called the county sheriff's office and a woman named Deputy Sarah Vance. No relation, though we joked about it. Showed up within the hour, and she didn't in oppose. Just take a report. She took the footage, she took the muddy prints, and she took the folder of fake legal documents I compiled. She looked at me and said, in quote, Mr. Vance, this has moved way past a neighborhood squabble. We're looking at criminal trespass, conspiracy to commit a crime, and if they used HOA funds for this in oppose, advisor and oppose, we're looking at felony embezzlement, end quote. Over the next 2 weeks, the, end quote, Thorn Empire, end quote, collapsed in a way that was both spectacular and deeply satisfying. The sheriff's department served search warrants on Cynthia's home and Marcus's condo, seizing laptops and phones. That revealed a web of corruption that went back years. It turned out Cynthia hadn't an oppose. Just been targeting me. She'd been running a systematic extortion racket, targeting elderly residents with fake fines and then offering to, end quote, waive, end quote, them in exchange for private cash payments or under-the-table land easements. She'd been working with a shady private contractor who'd been blacklisted by the state licensing board, paying him thousands in HOA dues to act as her personal, end quote, enforcement squad, end quote, to intimidate anyone who dared to question her authority. The audit that Denise and the new board conducted found over $40,000 in, end quote, missing, end quote, funds redirected into shell companies that Cynthia used to pay for her own legal defense and her nephew's, end quote, consulting fees, end quote. The final blow came when the district attorney's office got involved and Cynthia was arrested in front of the whole neighborhood on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember watching from my porch as they led her away in handcuffs, no pearls this time, just a look of pure, unbridled shock that the world hadn't into Oppos. T bowed to her clipboard. She was eventually sentenced to 2 years for wire fraud and falsification of records, and Marcus got a hefty dose of community service and a permanent restraining order from our neighborhood. But the real change was in Oppos. In the courtroom, it was in the air of the community itself. We held a special election, and I was asked to help rewrite the charter, which I did with one non-negotiable condition: that every single financial transaction the HOA makes is posted online in a real-time, searchable database that every resident can see. Nowadays, the waterfront is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's the sound of people actually enjoying their homes instead of living in fear of a yellow notice on their door. And my boat is still docked exactly where it belongs, the sun glinting off the chrome like a badge of honor. People walk by now, and they don in Oppos. Look for violations, they just wave, and sometimes they stop to ask what I'm catching or if I need a hand with the lines. And it makes me wonder, how many other neighborhoods are out there right now, being held hostage by some petty tyrant with a clipboard and a sense of entitlement? But you have to ask yourself, in a situation like that, who's really at fault? Is it the one person who craves the power, or is it the dozens of us who let them have it because we're too busy or too tired to fight back? I chose to fight, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat, because at the end of the day, a man's home, ISN and Oppos. Just his castle. It's the only place on earth where he should be able to breathe without asking for permission. So, what do you think? Did I go too far by calling in the feds and the auditors? Or is this the only way to handle an HOA that's gone rogue? Have you ever had a neighbor try to claim authority they didn't in Oppos? Have? And how far would you go to protect your own dirt? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling my story is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what's happening behind those gated community walls.